is the full-length video tutorial for the Lola dress by Ali's Patterns. This design has 3 different sleeve options: sleeveless, the regular puff sleeve, and the mega puff sleeve. It has a gathered skirt with a side seam slit and boning along each princess seam line. Before we begin, please read through the entire packet so you have a thorough knowledge of exactly what this project entails. There are 2 different kinds of boning that you can use for your dress. For the pink dress, I used ridgeline boning because I was creating casings from the seam allowance, but for the white dress, I wanted to use boning that had a polyester cover / casing already built into it because I wanted it to be on the outside, which I thought would look pretty. Something you may also want to consider is if you are using a very fine fabric, like this is a wedding dress, or you have a fabric that's very loosely woven like gauze, which is what I used for my pink dress, I recommend getting end caps for your boning. This will soften the edge of the tips of your boning so that it doesn't slowly create holes over time in your casing or on your fabric. So for this pink dress that I'm showing you right now, everything is almost exactly the same except for the fact that it does not have sleeves, so I'll show you how to finish off those straps, and then we'll be going over how to create boning casing by using the seam allowance. Now I will be adding skirt linings to both of the samples that I'm going to be showing you in this video because the fabric is just so thin. However, it's not required. My first sample that I made out of that toile fabric, I did not include a lining because it was not transparent. But linings always give you an opportunity to encase raw edges, so it's kind of a benefit. I recommend it if you want it to look extra nice. Oh, and you can, obviously, you don't have to do a short lining. You can literally cut the skirt pieces just twice and have it go all the way down to the bottom. But I just want these to be a little bit more playful, and I think it would be cute if it was transparent halfway down. So this is the front lining, and then we have our back skirt lining, and there's 2 of these because we're gonna be putting a zipper down center back. So those are our lining pieces. And then here are the rest of the pieces for the pink dress. Now, if you are using a very loose weave or lightweight, slippery, unsupportive fabric for this dress, I recommend ironing or sewing on some interfacing before you start constructing the bodice, because it will really help add some structure and support. In my case, I didn't realize I would need or want interfacing until after my first fitting. So I will show you how to add it to your bodice after it's constructed. All I did was use the same pattern pieces that I originally cut out my bodice with, and then I just trimmed down the seam allowances on every single piece and then mirrored them and cut out the second half. Now I used fusible interfacing, but I still ended up sewing them directly to the lining. Some people use tulle, some people just use cotton muslin. It just depends on the support and structure that you're needing. There's a few important things that I want to go over real quick. When you're ironing on interfacing as an afterthought, it's very important to press and move the interfacing along that princess bust seam as you go along so that you don't lose that beautiful cup shape that we created underneath the sewing machine. The best way to go about this is to just use the tip of your iron to press little tiny areas one at a time and use your fingers to shift that interfacing around in each little tiny spot. Secondly, if you're wanting to create boning casings with the seam allowance of the lining, then make sure when you iron this interfacing on that you're ironing it underneath each seam allowance. So the seam allowances will be popping out of that interfacing. Because, for example, if you are wanting to use silk or velvet and you don't want any extra holes on the exterior of your shell, then you would need to add the interfacing and the boning to the lining. On my pink dress, I just added the boning onto the shell and then I added the interfacing to the lining. So that didn't really apply to me. After I ironed everything on, then I did a bunch of stitches down the entirety of the lined bodice because I didn't want it shifting around. Again, I had a very loose weave fabric that was very prone to fraying and shifting. And I also wanted my dress to kind of have this negligee undergarment vibe to it. so I thought it would be really pretty. On the center back, I did stitches 1/4 of an inch apart all the way down, and then once I moved onto all the other bodice pieces, I did them 1/2 an inch apart because I didn't think that there would be as much strain or pressure in those areas. This is what it looks like afterwards. I think it turned out so beautiful. I was really excited at this point in the project, but I want to clarify that this pattern is actually not that hard to sew. This looks very complicated and time consuming, primarily because I chose a very difficult fabric to work with. The fabric choice determines about 70% of the difficulty for pretty much any sewing project. Anyways, I ended up trimming off about 1/2 an inch from the bottom because after all of that stitching, I had a lot of fraying on the bottom that was pretty much unusable, but I did do a basting stitch around the entire garment at this point so that the fraying would stop. So keep that in mind when you watch me sew. The rest of this skirt, I will be using 1/2 an inch around the waistline, but in reality, it's still a 1 inch seam allowance. With all that being said, let's jump into making the Lola dress sleeveless version with bone encasing created from the seam allowance. I want to start out by sewing down center front on the shell and the lining. My fabric is the same as the shell and the lining. The reason I like to do the center front piece first is because these seams right here look really similar, so you don't want to get them mixed up because there is more of a curve on this side or an angle for the breast. Just sew an inch seam allowance right here and there, and then press and move back here. Okay, let's go press those open. Let's sew the side front pieces to the center front pieces. Right sides together, and then we'll be sewing this side. Now with fabric like this, that just moves and stretches really easily, I want to make sure that it's being fed into the sewing machine evenly. So I'm kind of using my hands to push the top layer underneath the presser foot. And I like to start from the top. If you're gonna sew from the bottom up, then sew from the bottom up on the other piece as well. Because if there is any shifting, you know, you want it to be symmetrical. So I'm gonna start on the top on this side as well. Just have to flip it around so it looks a little different. Now what I love about a princess bodice is they fit very well. They're really easy to alter in the perfect way that you may need. Sometimes darts aren't as customizable in regards to fit as a princess bodice. So that's what we just did. I'm gonna do that again for the lining. Now, ideally, you will have a pressing ham to do this with, especially on a princess seam. You don't want to lose that beautiful curve that we just did. A pressing ham looks like this, but you can also use like a rolled up towel, especially if you're working with a fabric with a pile like velvet. That will help keep your fabric from getting smashed down. Pressing in couture is just as time consuming as time spent on the sewing machine because you can mold the fabric with heat and moisture in ways you can't achieve with a sewing machine. Now let's attach the side back pieces. Pin it in place. I actually tried to practice sewing without pins because they take up so much time. If you're working with an easy fabric, it's a good opportunity to practice sewing without pins on really short seams like this. Whenever I'm sewing a long seam, I use pins just because the feed dogs can sometimes feed it in just slightly unevenly, but after a long stitch, a slight difference can make it uneven at the bottom. We're gonna sew a 1-inch seam allowance on each of those side seams. And then I also want you, while it's just under the sewing machine, to sew across the shoulders on the top. And on my handwritten pieces, I have it as a 1/2-inch seam allowance, but for your pattern piece, for when I digitize this, I'm gonna make it 1 inch. So just keep that in mind. Mine's gonna look shorter, just so that you have extra room for adjusting things. So here I have my shell and my lining. It's just more efficient to do both at the same time. We're only going to be doing casings for the boning on one of them. If you don't want the casings to show on the outside, you can always do casings on the lining too. That's actually what I did for those Christmas dresses I made last year, because I didn't want any holes on the outside shell because I was using silk and velvet. So I just did boning on the lining, which gave the fabric some extra support and structure. So just doing 1/2 inch, but yours will be 1 inch. On the shoulders. Do that to the other side. Now, a lot of people ask, what linings should I use? Just think balance. If I'm working with a really light fabric for my shell, choose a heavier lining. If you're working with a really heavy shell, then choose a lighter lining. We are now going to take the center back pieces and add them to the bodice. So this one's, again, like you might want to mark your notches because this one's center back. See how that's straight? And then this one's more angular. So we want to make sure we're attaching it properly. And then we'll be sewing a 1-inch seam allowance again. Also, you don't have to add boning all the way around either. On my first sample, the toile dress, I only added boning on the front and then I think underneath the arm. On the back, I didn't add any because I don't want it to be like super uncomfortable. It was my first time using boning ever, but for these, I think I'm gonna do it all the way around because I practiced more with boning last year with my Christmas dresses, and I liked how there was boning on the back as well, just kind of like sexy in. So same thing, 1 inch here and there, and then we'll leave the back open because we're gonna be attaching a zipper. So take this over to your machine. So go ahead and press these open. Now, I know a lot of my silhouettes are the same. Like this, especially without the sleeve, is gonna be pretty similar to the Matilda dress. However, it does have a higher back and it's a princess seam allowance. So a little bit of a different fit. We're gonna be adding boning. More princess seams are much more plus size friendly as well, because if you have a large bust, it just looks a lot more flattering compared to a dart. Okay, so before we move on to the casings for the boning, I want you to do a quick fitting of the bodice. The shell or the lining, doesn't matter, so that you can make any needed adjustments before you start putting a lot of work into your garment. So I'm just gonna show you how to do a quick fitting on my mannequin, but preferably you wanna do this on your actual body. I'm not gonna fit this right now because I'm pregnant. So you just wanna make sure you pin down center back, a 1 inch seam allowance. You can have someone do this for you. That's obviously ideal. If you're gonna make something and put in all this work, it should look perfect, and fitting it to your body is so important. Okay, see how it's kind of gaping out right here? We need to take it in a little bit down center front, and then maybe tighten these sleeves a little bit, or these straps, I should say. So any adjustments that you need to do, you can just pin it out. So I'll just pin it like this, and then I'll grab a ruler and measure how much I'm taking it in. Now typically, I don't recommend taking all of the ease out of just one seam. Like ideally you want to disperse it. And you don't have to go all the way down. Like see how it fits nicely right here? I'm not going to, continue that 1/4 inch all the way down. I'm just gonna take it in up here. And the reason why it's probably stretching out right here is because it's closer to the edge, and that's where the threads start to loosen up. I think I'm gonna iron some interfacing on this dress. Just on the bodice, skirt doesn't need it. Just so that it like stops stretching out, because even stay stitching with a weave this loose, it would help around these curves, but even every seam will eventually just start to kind of pull, and I wanna stabilize this. Let's work on creating the casings for the boning. You can also use a wider boning if you want. This is just a 1/4 inch. So what I did was I marked generally like where I'm gonna be stitching on the machine to create this casing. I want it to be wider than the boning I'm using by just like a tiny bit, because you need room to be able to slide that boning in. I'm gonna sew 2 casings for every seam allowance. 2 strips right here, 2 strips right here, 2 strips right here, and 2 strips right here. You don't want your boning to go past any seam allowances, because if it goes past a seam allowance, pressing it is impossible, and also flipping the lining over so that wrong sides are together is like impossible. You have to make sure that the boning is slightly shorter than where your seam allowance begins. This is the marking that I made earlier. I'm going to do this on the other side of the center front and then take it back to the table just to show you exactly how to do it. I'm going all the way to the bottom, even though we're not going to be putting the boning in all the way to the bottom. Just want that stitch to be encased. Okay, so on center front, on the inside of the shell, because I want the stitching to show on the shell, I just did a stitch right and the left side of the seam. As you can see there, this blue mark was pretty inaccurate. I did it with chalk, but the sewing machine was easier to use. So there's my stitch line along there. And now we're going to insert the boning into this casing. I'm gonna mark this again for your sake. We do not want to go past the seam allowance on the top or the bottom. So I'm gonna just mark 1 inch right here. This one's a lot easier. And then 1/4 inch around the top. I mean, you want to get as close as you can, but it's better safe to just be slightly shorter. Also, don't use your fabric scissors for this. Just use some like household scissors. When you cut their boning, it can damage or just dull your scissors a lot faster. It's really easy to just straighten them out just by bending them. I've ironed them, but honestly, just bending it has been more effective than ironing. So I'm just gonna gently slide that all the way through, as you can see there. And then I'm gonna trim it just like 1/4 inch extra. So I'm just gonna pin across the top and bottom to keep that boning from sliding out. So yeah, you can just continue on. This is like the most time-consuming part of this dress, but it makes it so beautiful. Don't skip this step. I love the boning. It's gonna be really pretty, and it will teach you a lot. I think I just got this boning off of Amazon, but any, fabric sewing shop should have some. You can pre-cut all of your boning as well. I kind of like to do it as I go along because a lot of these lengths are really similar, so I end up pre-cutting everything only to just get confused about which boning goes where. So I kind of do it as I go along. I finished inserting the boning on my shell. Now any parts where it was like kind of bendy like this, you can quickly just kind of bend it, and look, that like pretty much solves the problem. And over time this will shape into what you want the more you wear it, but I do like to do it before just so that it is easier to work with. So now I'm going to lay the one that we applied all that interfacing to and did all that stay stitching. Looks so beautiful. We're gonna attach it right sides together so that when we flip it back around, this part is sandwiched in between. When I do this, I like to just line up all the seams, and we'll only be sewing around the top, starting from center back around the inside of the sleeve, I guess the neckline. Okay, we're gonna go just continue our stitch around this part, across center front, around this part again, keeping those right sides together like that, and then to center back. I don't really feel the need to pin anything down here, but sometimes I will if I just want to make sure that the fabric's not going to be slipping around. But usually it's adequate enough to just pin where I'll be sewing. Now it's really important around these corners that you line it up really well, because if we're gonna get a really crisp 90-degree angle, we need to make sure that all of the threads are caught, and then we'll cut with the scissors across to the point. So we'll sew basically like that, and then we'll use scissors to cut right there. But when you get to this point, I will like usually backstitch and go across it twice, just while I'm sewing across the top, because especially with this fabric, you really don't want there to be any fraying, or when you turn it inside out, sometimes, you know, a hole will develop, because once you clip to the point to allow you to get a nice 90-degree angle, it sometimes is just too close. And since my fabric is so thin, this is like basically gauze fabric, I might not even clip, just because I'm so worried this fabric's going to just fray. Okay, I forgot to take the straps in when we did the alteration on one of these layers, so I'm gonna go ahead and fix that so that this lines up. See how it's like bubbling out? Okay, I went and I fixed that shoulder seam that I forgot to transfer the alteration to, and it was still bubbling out a little bit. So what I did is I just pulled on this stitch that I did along the edge, my stay stitch, because this fabric had stretched out. And this can happen even with like a fabric that's not as loosely woven as this. But I just pulled on it gently to just like, I didn't create any gathers, but I just pulled it gently enough to allow this to just tuck in there. So again, I'm gonna make sure that this corner is perfect right here. And then I'm gonna put a pin in to keep that from shifting. So again, I'm not sewing the inside of this armhole yet, but I think I will be pinning it right here just to hold it in place. Now, this is why a lining's required for this dress, because it allows us to encase this raw edge around the top. So that's what it should look like. All right, let's take this over to the sewing machine. And this is 1/4 of an inch from the edge. And I'm going to shorten my stitch length because my fabric is such a loose weave. So now I'm at like a 2. Usually I sew like a 2.5 or a 3. Just make sure that those seams are pressed open. And you shouldn't be sewing through any boning. Remember, we trimmed that down. so that you could sew around the edges without hitting any of it, because it makes it impossible to turn right side out. Okay, now I'm gonna go back around that corner. Just back stitch. Okay, we have another 90-degree corner coming up. I'm just gonna back stitch along there. To make sure that, and then you lift your presser foot and rotate it with the needle down. All right, that looks good. Yeah, I'm going to see if I can turn this right side out and still get a nice 90-degree corner without clipping to the point, just because this fabric is so thin and I don't want to weaken it. But if you have like a normal fabric, then, or like a medium weight, then you'll want to clip to that point to allow you to get a crisp corner. Okay, we have another corner coming up, so I just want to double check to make sure that's perfectly aligned. Back stitch. Rotate. Back stitch again. All right, let's go flip it right side out on the table. Okay, this is the seam that we just did all the way around. And first, I'm actually going to press it, and I'm going to press it towards the lining. We'll be top stitching this. You don't have to top stitch, you could even just understitch. And an understitch is where you would have this opened up like this, and then you would only stitch through the seam allowance and the lining, so that when you flip this down, it is nice and like flat. But I like to top stitch. So if you have regular fabric, this is the point I'm talking about. This one does feel pretty bulky. First, I'm going to trim it down a little bit, trim off all this fraying. So you can see what's going on. Now, this is where we just sewed. What you would do is just clip right to that point. I'm going to clip just like halfway. And chances are my fabric's going to fray the rest of the way anyways. Just don't want to do any extra. Now let's go ahead and flip that. Press it down again. So these corners, when you flip it right side out, there's likely going to be a natural crease right there, and you want to try and work that out with your fingers before you top stitch. See how that's starting to like kind of pucker right there? You want to try and maneuver the fabric so that when you top stitch, it anchors it down in the proper place. Look how nice that's looking. Yeah, see, I didn't have to clip to that corner hardly at all. Now, if we were to add elastic, I want you to skip forward to the white dress, or skip backward, I'm not sure the order I'm gonna put this in yet, so you can see how to do the casing. To do the straps, turn under each layer 1/4 of an inch, and then we'll stitch it down. So go ahead and sew down that side out of 1-inch seam allowance and this side. Now I'm going to do a slit up the side of one of these. I do want mine to be pretty high. You can totally lower or heighten your slit. And the easiest way to do a slit is to just not sew the entirety of the side seams. We're going to press open that side seam of the skirt shell. And then we'll do that on the other side as well. Now, I still want you to iron back what would have been the seam allowance for this slit, because we're going to be finishing off that raw edge. You can mark it. I'm just going to eyeball it because my fabric does not mark up very well. Okay, once you have that ironed out, we'll start where? Up here. This is the top of the skirt. And now we're gonna be doing the same thing. We're gonna fold it under and iron and pin it down. The point is to just encase any raw edges. Like that. Try to make it as even as you can on either side. So, because your stitches will show on the outside, I'm aiming for like 1/2 inch on either side. And then just do this all the way down to the slit, so that even where it's open right here, we tuck it under, pin it, iron it, so that when this dress opens up while you're walking or, you know, crossing your legs, it looks really nice on the inside. If you had a lining that went all the way to the bottom, then you could just like sew it to this part so that they encase each other's raw edges. Okay, so just continue that, and then I'm gonna iron this and then we'll sew it down. Now it's tempting to pull this to straighten it out, but you just want to make sure you're not messing up this grain either. So I try and, if I do need to pull it, I have to make sure that it's not distorting anything else. And then once we get to the top of the slits coming up here, right above where you backstitched, I want you to rotate the fabric around the needle as it's down in the fabric, and go across this part to ensure that seam doesn't rip open. And then I'm actually going to just travel back down this slit, and then we'll start up again up here after we're done. I just want this to be one continuous stitching line. Okay, so that's what we just did. That little, when we traveled across for that slit. This is what it looks like. And then this is what the right side looks like. It looks really nice. So, and then with my skirt lining, I'll just finish the hem of that so that it stops a little bit higher than that. At 1 inch seam allowance up here and then right there. So next, press those seams open, and then we will finish off the edges of those seams. And I don't have hot pink serger thread, so I'll be just doing, I think it's called just like a clean finish, where you turn it under and then stitch it down. So this is one way you can finish it. What you'll do is you're gonna turn under that seam allowance like that. And I like to press before I even pin. It really does make your life so much easier and makes it look really nice. Press that down. So I have it pinned in a few areas, and I'm just going to sew right along this edge so that it's not flipping open. Fold right here to be right on the inside of this side. Luckily, this thread just blends right in with my fabric, but if you don't have thread that blends right in, you might want to trim this down and do 1/4 of an inch. Like something that's just more thin, so that it doesn't look, so it looks more like, you know, just a top stitch from the outside. This is just the lining too, so I mean, you're not gonna see much. And I'm trying to keep the distance between the seam right here and this foot even the entire way. You kind of just have to eyeball it because our guides are covered up. Okay, now that we have these seam allowances on the inside of the lining nice and clean finished, we are going to do a basting stitch around the top to gather it in to the bodice. Now I'm going to do this 1/2 inch from the edge, and I'm going to make my stitch length really long. And you always want to back stitch on one end, but then keep the other end free. Sew all the way across. And if you have a really thick fabric, 2 rows of basting stitches is recommended. Mine's really light, so I'm just gonna do 1 row. And I need to clean up my edges still. Okay, then just run it off the machine, don't backstitch. And then we will take it over to the table. Okay, I'm gonna move this out of the way. So take the piece that you didn't backstitch on for the skirt and grab the bobbin thread. Don't cut it, I'm just grabbing it with a tool. Sometimes it gets just twisted up. And pull that so that it starts gathering your skirt in. Now once it generally starts looking like it's going to be the same length as the bodice, I usually will start pinning until I can get it to line up. But I think this side needs to be gathered in some more. And I just eyeball it. I like to do my gathers by hand, because then you can like customize where you want the fullness as well. If you have wider hips, then you can have all the gathers in the front and back instead of around the sides. Okay, we're getting really close here. Just like another inch or two should do the trick. We'll only be pinning it to the lining side of the bodice. And keep those gathers. See how there's gathers near the center back? I want to make sure that it's nice and flat. So, and then we'll line up the side seam of the front and the back skirt lining to the side seam of the underarm on the bodice. Get it so it's nice and flat like that. And then you can kind of adjust the gathers as you go. And then once you like the way it looks, just pin it in place. And then continue on to the very end. Okay, once you're done, it should look something like this. These are separated from the shell of the bodice. This is the lining and the lining skirt. Now that we have it all pinned, I'm going to sew the skirt lining to the bodice lining. Now I'm just going to be sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance because remember we trimmed down a lot of that length on the bodice due to fraying. So this is technically still where that inch seam allowance was. But yeah, I like to sew on the gathered side because that's just where things get a little messier. And a lot of times when I do lots of gathering, I like to use flathead screwdriver. See, sometimes when I will do gathering, this top will like flip down like that. So it's nice to have the ability to use this flathead all the way up until it goes under the needle, because I don't like to get my fingers that close. That's when I sewed through my fingers when I was doing gathering with tulle. I just got a little too close. Now if you need to lift up the presser foot to just make any adjustments, that's okay. I know I'm going so slow right now, but it's better that way. It's always better to go slow than going too fast and then having to unpick. Unpicking always takes longer. Okay, so what we just did was we sewed the skirt lining to the bodice lining, right sides together. And when you flip it down and then grab those, this is what it should look like on the lining side. I'm going to just quickly iron down the seam on the inside, and then we will attach the shell skirt, and then it will encase all these raw edges and it will look super pretty. I don't like to encase the raw edges of my skirt into the bodice because I like that to be as thin as possible. That's where you want to accentuate the waist and like how small it is. And if you add bulk into there, then it's just gonna look not as flattering. So I like to add all the bulk below the waist. Okay, so let's set this aside. So now we'll do a basting stitch around the waist of the shell, all the way across to the other side. Once you have that basting stitch, let's lay this out so that we're looking at the shell on the right side. And we are going to gather this skirt in by grabbing the bobbin thread and just pulling it like we did last time, so that it is the same width as the bodice. And we'll be putting right side to right side. Like this. And we're only pinning it to the shell. And I'm just lining up those seams first. And then we'll go in and disperse the gathers evenly, more evenly. And then keep the gathers an inch away from center back so that we can insert that zipper nicely. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and add some more pins and disperse the gathering, and then I'll show you before I sew it. Okay, so this is what you should have. This is the lining pieces, the bodice and the skirt. This is the shell skirt and the shell bodice. And I just have everything pinned for right now, but I'm gonna go over to my machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance to attach this skirt to the shell. And the reason I'm only doing 1/2 inch is because I had to trim some off. You will be doing a 1 inch unless you made some alterations or trimmed some fabric down as well. Just a quick reminder, make sure you shorten your stitch length again, because the last thing we did was a basting stitch. This is what we just did, and this is what it looks like on the inside. So everything's encased. We are going to do a 1 inch seam allowance, and it's really helpful to mark it, and you'll want to do this on the shell and the lining. I'm going to fold this back on those markings that I made to iron it down so it's just easier to work with. You'll want to get some embroidery floss, and I will be actually splitting this to something a little bit more thin. So I'll probably take out like a couple threads. So I'll actually be going through the lining. See, this is the seam for the neckline. I mean, this is center back, but I'll be going through this back half right here, just underneath that seam, like that. So you'll tie a knot at the end of this to keep it from slipping through, like that. Then we are going to loop it back around and just pierce the fabric like this to make a loop, like so. See that? Okay, so after you have this loop, you're going to take the thread with your needle on it and create a loop within this loop. See that? And then pull that through to tighten that other loop, like that. And then you'll just do this over and over again until you start to get this strand. You can stop here to just kind of check to see if that will go around your button. I still have a lot more to go. I may have to start over and give myself a little bit more thread, but I'll keep going for now and just see how far I can get. Okay, once you get to this point, hopefully you were smarter than me and you had more thread, but I have just enough, so I'm going to try and do it anyways. You want to put your needle back through the hole, not creating a loop this time, and just pull it through to tie a knot. See, there's our chain. And then I'm going to put it back through the top of the lining right here. I want to make sure I pierce some interfacing so that it doesn't slip as much. And then I will try and tie a knot with these little tiny threads. But that's the loop. So after all is said and done, this is what my loop looks like on the inside. And then on the outside, this is the button that it will go over. It's just another pretty way to finish the top. Okay, so here we have the pink dress. I have it open so you can kind of visualize what I'm about to do. We're going to fold this over. Now I want you to take your zipper. I recommend 20 to 22. Now I'm going to mark where my zipper is going to end. I'm going to trim off a little bit of the tape on the top. So I'm going to have it end at 20 inches. Now that we marked where the bottom of the zipper is going to end, I want to sew up from the bottom. So we'll sew the skirt lining up to that marking that we made. Right sides together, just from the bottom to the top. And then we'll do the same thing for the shell, which we'll have to turn it this way now. See how it's right sides together for the shell. Pin that together and stitch it up from the hem. Okay, so before I start just hand basting the zipper in, I am going to use a few pins in some critical areas just to keep things from shifting around, like the waist seams. So I'm essentially sandwiching the zipper between the shell and the lining like this. Especially that top part, I kind of want that top part to honestly be like hidden like that. And then the teeth will just start to kind of stick out a little bit more, but I like to keep that top part closed off. I'm just gonna stick a pin in there until I can get my needle ready. And we're hand basting this just like we did for the white one, because it really does make your life so much easier, especially when you're doing this kind of zipper where you're working with multiple layers. It can start to get really tricky. And I know there's some people that will do the zipper like the very first step, but that's just not how I've done it. Because, you know, I do fittings and stuff also throughout my project. So doing the zipper first just doesn't really make sense for me, but maybe I'll start to teach you how to do it earlier on in the process, just because it does help make it look a little cleaner. It's faster. This is just how I was taught, so I'm going to zip this back up actually, because I like to line my fabric up to that line. So the lining will look like this on the reverse side, but then the front will go all the way to that center mark on the zipper. You can use pins as well to help. So just go ahead and do this along the first side, and then I'll show you what that side looks like before I start the other side. Okay, so this is what it looks like on the left side of the dress. Okay, I've started basting the other side of the zipper. Just let this fabric kiss. And then on the other side, we just want to make sure we're not putting the fabric over the zipper coil. So I finished basting, and then I want to turn and go up the other direction at this point. So I am going to unzip the dress and sew one side at a time. And here again, we see that zipper tape, or sorry, that zipper coil curling out from underneath. But that's okay. Just sew along the fold of the fabric. That will curl back under once we're done. I'm gonna go ahead and move this zipper out of the way just a little bit. Then lift your presser foot, rotate it like that. So you're traveling directly across the bottom of that zipper. So there's the button and the loop that we made. So depending on the length of your slit, that will determine the length of the slip underneath, because you don't want it sticking out like that. But if your slit is lower, then you can just do like a double 1/4 inch roll, or you can just serge and turn it. It's up to you. But I'm going to, because my slit is so high, I'm going to do like 1.5 inch double roll like this, and then stitch it down. And I'm going to do the same thing for the bottom of my dress, of the shell. I'm going to do a double inch roll like that, and then just stitch across. Once you're done with the hem, you should be all finished. Congratulations! One last final step to make your garment look super professional and nice is to do one final press and trim off all thread tails. Tag me and show me your makes. I would love to see what you guys create. Now we will jump into making the Lola dress with the regular puff sleeve and the pre-encased boning on the outside of the shell with elastic around the shoulders. This all together, and if you want you can go ahead and sew those shoulders together at the top right here. And I think I'm going to change the pattern so that it's a 1-inch seam allowance, just like the rest of the dress, but for my first sample I just have it at 1/2. Whatever boning you decide to use, the first step is to mark where all of your seam allowances are around the waistline and the top around the neckline where we will be attaching the lining and the underarm of the side seams of your bodice, because you do not want any hard boning going past that point. Because I'm using casing, I actually am going to have the casing itself extend past that point because then I can anchor it down between the seams, but I will be trimming off the boning on the inside of that casing so that it becomes soft around that waist seam allowance. Now for my white dress, I am attaching the boning to the outside of the shell. So I wanted to put the boning directly over the seam on the shell, but some people will put a piece of boning on each side of the seam, which is what I do for my pink dress because I create casings from the seam allowances. But if you have boning with casing, you can also do this method where you just put one piece over each seam. Now, if your boning is really curvy, you can either iron it down or you can just fold it with your hands and kind of mold it. And I think that way is honestly more effective than the iron. And I recommend straightening it out before sewing it down just because it won't distort your bodice as much while you continue working on it. Now, in the clips that you're looking at right now, you can see how I trimmed down the inside of that boning without cutting off that casing. Before you start stitching, I would switch to a zipper foot, something that's very narrow, because I don't like to remove the boning before I start sewing it down, because then you might accidentally make that casing too narrow. So I just get really, really close to the edge and sew down while the boning is still inside of that casing. just trimming off like, you know, 1/4 of an inch. So the next step is creating the casing for the elastic that's going to be around the neckline right here and for the cuffs of the sleeves. Now I want to show you my first sample so you know what we're going for. So see how this has a little scrunch? What you're going to do is measure over 1/2 inch and just sew along here. You're not going to go across the bottom yet because that's how we're going to tack the elastic down. You're going to have to put a pin in to hold it in place before we go across the front and the back. And when you go across the front and the back, I did it a lot closer to the edge, like 1/4 of an inch, just because I thought that would look prettier. But of course you can do a top stitch that's 1/2 inch from the front if you wish. That's kind of personal preference. So to get that elastic length, you're going to measure based off the size that you're making, because it's going to change between each person. You're going to measure the length and then just subtract like 1 inch. Now you don't have to worry about incorporating any overlap with the elastic because we aren't connecting the elastic pieces together. We're just tacking it here and then we're tacking it there. So I had about 10.5 to 11, so we will cut a 9.5 inch long elastic, and you can just use whatever you have on hand. This was the thinnest elastic I had, or you could use 1/4 of an inch elastic. It's not that big of a deal. So I already stitched this, if you can see, and then I just left it open. So you want to make sure when you're putting the elastic through, you leave a little bit of a lip of the elastic so that when you top stitch across the front and the back, it has a really strong hold on that elastic. So now let's weave it through. So you'll need to get a safety pin. You'll want to make sure you have some pins nearby. First, we're going to go through an opening on the bodice. Now before you get too far, I want you to make sure that your elastic doesn't accidentally go all the way through this, because you'll have to start over. This is the first spot we're going to pin, down here. So just make sure you take it a little slow first. Okay, I have a little bit more to go. About 1 inch. Now yep, so see how I have a little bit sticking out at the bottom right there? So we are going to pin that in place. Maybe I'll just pull it like a little further. And I would use a couple of pins because once you start tightening this elastic and pulling it, you'll get a lot of tension. So now we'll just go a little bit past this point. So here's the back. Right there. And there's the casing. So here's the pin. I'm just gonna weave it through a little bit more. You know, I don't really want a ton of scrunch around the shoulders. You can do more or less depending on your personal preference. The more scrunch, you'll have to cut a shorter elastic. For less scrunch, just cut a longer elastic, but just keep in mind it's gonna grip less. I'm gonna do this side before I go over to the sewing machine, but once you get over to the sewing machine, I want you to sew all the way across the top, making sure that your lining is hidden behind the shell, and go 1/4 inch all the way across the back and the front so that you really grab that elastic end right there. Okay, so let's start off by tacking down this part. Now my needles or my pins are getting in the way, so I'm just going to pull them out slightly. And I want to make sure that the lining is tucked under there. As much as possible. So we're just sewing 1/4 inch from the edge. I like to sew on the outside so I know that the lining's not peeking through. And then once we get to this corner right here and we catch that elastic, I want you to backstitch to the length of that elastic to just make sure it's really anchored down. And we're just meeting up with that corner. That's just the pin. Okay. The safety pin. Like, what am I feeling? Perfect. Okay, one more stitch. This is what it should look like once you're all finished. Looks like we anchored down the elastic, and you can open it up and trim that down if you like. See, there's just a little piece sticking out the bottom where we tacked it down. I'm gonna mark this just so it's easier for you all to see. I'm just going to be turning under 1/2 inch from the raw edge. Now, if you only have super thick elastic on hand, you can do a wider casing, but I just like how this distance of the top stitch is going to match the sleeves. And then you're going to measure around your bicep and get the exact length of elastic that you want. So mine's 10.5 all the way around. So I'm going to cut 10.5 exactly because I'm going to overlap the elastic. And that will create the tension that I need. So essentially what I'm talking about is when we thread it through, we're gonna be overlapping it like this much, almost. I mean, I like to overlap it that much because then I can tack it down a lot. So let's go ahead and sew all the way around the bicep on the sleeve, leaving about 1 inch opening, okay? My needle's gonna be piercing this fabric right on the edge, and that's what you want because it's going to allow you enough room to thread your elastic through, and it just looks nice to not have any excess lip on the inside. And the reason I like to measure this out before as well is because it's really tempting to freak out if it's getting too close to the edge and like adjust it while it's under the presser foot, but then you end up just getting kind of a messier result. We'll do that to the other sleeve as well. Okay, so this is what you should have. See how I left a little bit of it unstitched so we can thread that elastic through that opening. Before I weave through the elastic on the sleeves, I'm just going to press this. Grab the elastic, get a safety pin, and you just want to make sure this end doesn't disappear. Sometimes it gets stuck between the seam allowances on the inside. Sometimes you just have to work your way through it. Now my elastic is starting to flip, so just make sure you're being careful. I hate when my elastic twists so much, so you can add an extra tack somewhere to ensure that doesn't happen. Okay, so we got the pin all the way through. Now I can adjust this afterwards, but for right now, I overlap it about an inch. You want to make sure you're sewing it together like this, sandwich style. So we're going to tack that elastic to itself. And make sure it's not twisted either. Sometimes I'll accidentally twist it when I'm joining them together and I have to unpick it. And then we can pull that through the rest of the way and sew this shut. And if you want, you can do this from the outside just to make sure you line that stitch line up perfectly. Just make sure you're catching that fold of fabric, which usually you can just feel. Okay, finally we're going to take a break from the top and we're going to move on to the skirt portion of the Lola dress. This is your center front piece. We're going to take the two side back pieces and I want you to sew them along the side seams, the right sides together. Let's go sew those at a 1 inch seam allowance. Now, if you're doing a slit, stop at the dot marking. If you're not doing a slit, then just sew all the way down. Trim off any thread tails and serge these seams. Now, since we're underneath the serger, I'm going to go ahead and serge the hem of the dress and the top, because it's also easier to serge it now versus later after it's all gathered in and scrunched up and you have like less, you have more fabric you're working with. We have the side seams sewn and finished. Now we are going to take the top of the skirt and do 2 rows of basting stitches so we can gather it in. So back stitch on one end so when you're pulling it doesn't pull them out, but leave the other end free. I'm going to bring the bodice back over here just so it's within reach, because once we start gathering this in, you'll want to make sure you're not gathering it too much because it's supposed to fit into the bodice waistline. Just kind of walk it along to see. Pretty close, so I'm just going to gather in a little bit more. Now also keep in mind, you don't want any gathers like an inch from this edge, because that's where you're going to be putting in the zipper. The zipper extends past the waistline. If you have a bunch of gathers in here, it's just going to make your zipper harder to do. It's going to make it look a little messier, so I will always shift my gathers away from the edge. See why it's nice to serge everything beforehand? Ugh. Okay, then we have center front, and the crease is right here. I like to have my waist seam allowance pushed downwards into the fullness of the skirt so that your waist looks as small as possible. Any extra bulk up into the bodice I don't think ever looks good. So if any of it was like gaping open like that because it needed to be gathered in some more, you can always, gather it in manually by hand and pin it down, or you can just keep pulling those basting stitches to tighten it up. I'm gonna make sure all of my seams on my bodice are aligned. So I'm gonna add one right here too, because sometimes they can shift. Here I'm adding a lining to the white dress, again as an afterthought, because after fitting it and holding it up into different lighting situations, I realized how see-through the fabric was. So you can always add a lining afterwards, ideally as long as you just do it before the zipper so you're not having to do a lot of unpicking, but just attach it to the other side of that waist seam allowance so that when you flip it down, it encases all of those raw edges within the skirt, which is always so nice. It makes it look so much better. And then just stitch it down at a 1-inch seam allowance and then press. Sewing the skirt pieces and the bodice together in one step can be a little less stressful for some beginners, but just keep in mind you won't be able to do that sandwiched invisible zipper between the shell and the lining. You'll just have to flip it back as one entire piece. And in that case, you'll want to finish the hem of the lining before you do that, because they won't be separated layers like they are with the pink dress. It still looks exactly the same from the outside, but on the inside it just doesn't look as nice. But if you're a beginner and you don't really care, I would opt for this option just because it won't make you as frustrated. If you are turning back all of the layers of the dress for a simple invisible zipper, Then finish the hem of the lining and then serge the skirt lining and shell wrong sides together on each side of center back. If you don't have a serger but you still want to turn back all of those layers at the same time so that you just have an easier zipper experience, then just skip the serging and you can just baste those layers together just to hold them in place. And then after you insert the zipper, you can add binding to enclose all of those ridges on the inside, which looks so good. And it's a lot easier than doing that sandwich zipper. This is a pretty informal dress, so I just had the serged edge showing on my hem on the inside. But if this was a more formal dress, I'd probably have that edge turned underneath instead of having it serged. So that's just kind of personal preference. You can decide on what you want to do. You can either use chalk, but since I'm using white fabric, I don't want the chalk to leave any marks. I'm going to just press it, which I want you to press anyways, whether or not you use chalk. Now remember, center back has a 1-inch seam allowance and we've already trimmed off 1/4 of an inch. So we'll do 3/4 of an inch turned back. And I want you to use ideally a 20 to 22 inch zipper. I wouldn't go any shorter than that because this needs to get up around your hips. Even though it's gathered, you just don't want to risk not being able to put it on. Now I want you to make sure this is aligned, the waist seam. That lining's perfectly aligned. It's looking nice. Okay, so we'll go ahead and sew a 3/4 inch seam down from this pin right here to the bottom. That should be fine. Okay, I'm using an invisible zipper, but you can use a regular zipper if you want. I used a regular zipper when I first made this dress, but then again, I did do a lapped zipper, so it was covering the teeth and everything. So you'll want to just get out a hand needle, and whenever I'm doing hand basting something in, I like to use a different color of thread. It's easier to unpick once you're done. Right sides will be together, so we have it turned under already, and we're going to align this fold right with the middle of that tape right there. Now I'm going to be adding a hook on the top of this, but I do like when the zipper goes a little bit higher than that, like maybe 1/4 of an inch from the top. Let's see, what is that? You can always trim this down. So I'm just going to start by just sewing it in. And I like to look at the right side so that I know it's perfect. And it doesn't have to look, you know, super nice as you baste this in. You're gonna be taking it out anyways, so. Okay, now we will work on the other side. Please excuse some of the paint that I have on my hands. I was doing a Valentine's craft project with my toddler a little while ago, and got messy. You can turn it right side out too if that's helpful for you, just for the beginning. Just really want to make sure that the zipper tape is aligned and this top part is aligned. I just do like a little X anchor stitch. Now that's looking good. All right, so this is what I have now. Down center back. Change out your presser foot. I personally just like the regular zipper foots. If you start to see your zipper tape kind of roll out from underneath your fabric and you're like, the fold of my fabric isn't covering the teeth anymore, don't freak out, because when you lift up your presser foot, it rolls back underneath the fabric. Just focus on aligning your presser foot to the fold of the fabric and you should be fine. The hardest part is if you accidentally did get some gathers right here, making that look nice. Now once you get to where you stopped on the other seam, we are going to go across and then go back up the other side of the zipper. So lift that presser foot, rotate it, go across about 3 stitches, and then go back up. I didn't run my needle off the fabric. I kind of wanted to stop it at this 1/4 inch mark right there from where we top stitched. I do want it to stick out a little bit past the zipper tape, but not a lot. I just want to show you guys up close what it looks like. I tried to continue the lines of the zipper stitches and the top stitching. It's not perfect, but a lot of the anchor stitches that I did to hold this eye down, I just did to the seam allowance so that there wasn't just a lot of, stitches on the outside. I just did a few on the outside, there and there, to also anchor down this flap from poking up. So now that's anchored down. And then I went in between these 2 layers, the seam allowance and the shell, to anchor it down even more. You want it to kiss, just like the zipper. So I'll probably tuck in the hook a little bit more so that the fabric kisses. I'm going between the layers like this first, and then I'll probably go across the top of this, just like I did on the other side, to tack this part down so it's not like all over the place.